There is a B patch for patch 13.6 for TFT, so that means we have a couple of updates that we're making to our meta snapshot, a couple reorderings, and that's all based on the meta shifts from this little change. So going on into the summary, we have in the S tier Spellslinger, Anima, Misfortune, Jhin, Infiniteam, Duelists, Vex, Jax, Lasercorps, and Threats in the S and A tier. And then in the B tier, we have Jinx Reroll, Draven, Hearts, and Samira. So a bit of a shift. Spellslinger is definitely by far the best comp. Anima, Misfortune, it's not right behind it, but it definitely is behind it. And then after that, there's a bit of a drop off for all the other comps. That's not to say there's no reason to go for the other comps. It just means they're a little more dependent on things like augments. So Infiniteam with Infiniteam, Heart, Crest, and Soul, it's going to be incredible if you get a good start for it, and it's going to be S+ tier if you get those kind of augments. But if you're looking at comps that are not augment reliant, that are also really, really strong right now, that's like pretty much just Spellslingers. So you're going to see a lot of that in the next couple of days, possibly the entire week. Also for sub rankings, if you want to know what's S+, S-, A+, A-, B+, B-, instead of just S, A, and B, I did add a Patreon because some people were saying like, hey, like I don't want to make an OnlyFans account. So for the people that want like a different site to access that information, it'll be the same on both sites. You only need to do one or the other. I did open up the Patreon at patreon.com/BunnyMuffins. So onto the comps. So in the S tier, and we're going to do a little more in-depth detail this week compared to last week. Let's first go over Oxforce SpellSlingers. So it's a bit of a weird comp because there are a couple of different versions of the build. Some people like the 4 Oxforce version, and there's nothing wrong with that. 2 different versions of the comp definitely exist. Some people like the 4 Star Guardian version. So when do you go each? So if you ever get good items on your Nico is generally going to be a duo carry with Twisted Fate, but if you ever favor more items on your Nico, 4 Star Guardian is really going to unlock her potential a lot more. That's when you add in the Nyla and Syndra. If you're mainly revolving around Twisted Fate damage, then the 4 Oxforce version might be slightly tankier. You also have to keep in mind in the Star Guardian version, you need to hit Syndra because it's not really worth playing 4 Star Guardian without her. So if you don't hit Syndra, play the 4 Oxforce version. You pretty much just replace Nyla and Syndra for Fiora and Viego. So the weird part about this build is that it plays out a little differently than most TFT comps in the past. So normally in TFT, you want 3 items on your primary carry and 3 items on your primary tank. Generally in TFT, you get around like 6 items per game at the start of stage 5, somewhere around there. Sometimes you get a little more if there's some goofy glitched out carousels or something like that, but on average in TFT, you get around like 6 completed items by the time stage 5-1 comes around. So you generally put 3 on your main carry and 3 on your main tank. But for this build, you want to put 2-2-2. 2 on your main tank, 2 on Twisted Fate, 2 on Nico. Again, the reason behind that is because you're running a duo carry comp, so that would be the preferred setup. That's not to say you want to force that type of build. If you get like 3 best in slot items for Twisted Fate, for example, let's say you have Static Shiv, Giant Slayer, and Rage Blade on Twisted Fate, like yes, you build all 3 items on Twisted Fate. But I'm just saying if you could try to help it, like on your carousel decisions, try to split your items between your Echo for tank items, Twisted Fate for attack speed, and Nico for AP and mana items. Just keep in mind this comp right now is heavily contested. There are around like 3 players per game for this Twisted Fate comp, which is quite a bit. Luckily, it's a bit flexible, as we discussed before. There are the 2 versions we already talked about, which is the Star Guardian version and then the Oxforce version, but there's also the Spellslinger version, which goes more into like 6 Spellslinger. All of them have their merits. Some of them are better at different stages because some are cheaper than the others. For example, playing 6 Spellslingers is a little bit cheaper. So those comps are great in like stage 4 and 5, but maybe fall off towards the late game where you want to replace it with other units. There are also a couple reroll versions such as LeBlanc Reroll, Sona Reroll, things of that nature, which you could also pivot into if you get those types of games. So how to play this, you want to have Sureshots. It's just the best item on Nico. And then in the early game, you play around Star Guardians and Spellslingers, and then you slowly pivot into the comp you see here. So you use item holders such as like Lux, great item holder in the early game. Lulu, same thing, especially with Gadgetines early. LeBlanc and Sona are going to be your 3-cost item holders, and then Kai'Sa, sometimes you use her. She's not as preferred as Sona and LeBlanc, but she's still pretty usable. You all can check out this full write-up on the website bunnymuffins.lol/meta because we work with Void Sin, who is a top challenger player, who writes this meta snapshot. So onto the recommended items. We're going to start off with Nico's items: Spear, Shojin, Jeweled Gauntlet, Guardbreaker, Rabadon's pretty much generic AP items that we've always been building, Giant Slayer, and Hextech Gunblade. Twisted Fate items is going to be Static Shiv, Rage Blade, Giant Slayer, Death Cap, Jeweled Gauntlets, and Hextech Gunblade. And then for tank items, literally any generic tank items work for Echo. It's going to be stuff like Warmogs, Dragonclaw, Gargoyle Stoneblade, Bramble Vest, I'm probably missing a bunch of other usable tank items. You could also put like utility items on him, but almost anything works with that. Speaking of items, we did release the item guide on YouTube, which you guys can check out, but there also is a section on my website at the top. You just click on items, and then we have like my recommended items for every single champion. But let's get back into the meta snapshot. Let's move on into the augments, which is going to be a little bit weird because for the hero augments, we have the recommendations up here. You may have noticed that we actually recommend Nico augments over the Twisted Fate augments. So it's not to say that the Twisted Fate augments are bad. They're mainly good because you get a copy of Twisted Fate. The effect of the augments, while they are nice to have, they're not really the reason why you take them. You take the Twisted Fate augments just because they give you an extra copy of him, and this comp is highly contested, so getting him 2-star is just that much more important. For the Nico augments, they are going to be your go-tos. The support one, called Easy Being Green with Sureshots, is incredibly good on her. It's just the best augment in the comp, and then her carry one is also usable. But of course, in these images, we have other recommended augments for Prismatic, Gold, and Silver tier, so definitely take a look at that when you guys have a chance, and we have an even bigger list down here. But on to the next build, we have Misfortune Anima Squad. So this is definitely a step below the Spellslinger comp, but it's still very powerful, and you share one item, which is called Sureshots, because if you build that item early on in the game, you could kind of flex into both of the comps. You could even go from like a Anima Squad start and then into Spellslingers later on. It could be done in many different ways. This comp is a little more dependent on items and augments though. For example, if you ever get the Anima Squad emblems, they bump the comp up to S+ tier. You may have noticed in this image up here, we do recommend like the Spellslinger emblems and stuff like that. While they are good, they don't make or break the comp. For Anima Squad, they definitely do. Getting Anima Squad emblem to enable 5 Anima Squad really early or 7 Anima Squad in the late game is just so powerful. And it's just something that can't be ignored with the comp. For the complementary units in Anima Squad, you just run 5 Anima as the core, and then you can run other units. In this image, we have Echo, Garen, and Fiddlesticks. These provide a lot of good synergies. We have the Prankster with Echo. We have Fiddlesticks as Fiddlesticks. He's just solid legendary unit and a great Ionic Spark holder. And then we have Garen, which is pretty much the Sejuani of this set. So last set, Sejuani did a big AoE stun. Garen does the same thing at 4-cost tank, and he shares a synergy with Riven, which is Defender. So Garen can just be very solid from that aspect. The most important thing about this comp is having Misfortune 2-star, so to do that you want to follow the standard leveling pattern, which typically revolves around playing around 4-cost units. You want to hit level 7 around stage 4-1. You might have to roll a little bit there, but if you can, you could do like a fast 8. You can roll a little bit there if you're a little low or if you have a lot of pairs, but if not, you roll on 8, get Misfortune 2-star, and she is going to dominate a large part of the game. She is the most important unit, but you don't need her in stage 4. If you get her around like stage 5-1, that's fine too. So just make sure you stabilize during stage 4 so you don't die out before that point. Onto the items, again, you can check out the item page to see my favorite MF items, but Sureshots is the only required item. After that, just build whatever damage items you can. Oh yeah, one other exception is that one other way to play this comp, and this is like the only thing that really changes it, is if you get Spread Shot for Vayne. It's really good if you go for a Vayne carry, and she also uses a Sureshots. So if we move back into the recommended items, for Spread Shot Vayne, we have an item recommendation over here, which is Shojin, Infinity Edge, and Deathblade. But let's go on into the A tier with Jhin Renegades. So Jhin is going to be the primary carry for the Renegade comps. It's no longer Viego. This is kind of like another duo carry comp, except this version's a little bit different from most TFT duo carry comps in that you don't really run a tank. The tanks are just going to be generic units such as like Alistar and Leona. I guess you could throw Camille in there even though she's not that tanky. Since you're running Riftwalker, you also have a Zac. And pretty much Zac gives you +1 Renegade as well, so this should actually show 5 Renegades. I just forgot to update the image with Zac on it. And to do that, you just want your Zac close to your Jhin. So if you put Zac on the top left here, that should activate the trait with Jhin. It's pretty much whichever Riftwalker your Zac is closest to, that's the extra trait that you get. So you could put it next to Vex for Mascot, you could put it next to Pyke for Hacker, but you generally want to put it next to Jhin so that you get the Renegade trait. That way you get 5 Renegade and the comp gets a lot more powerful. But again, like your tanks don't really need items because Fiddlesticks is naturally tanky, you have Oxforce already for your Alistar, and then you just need to focus on Viego and Jhin items after that. Luckily, there are a lot of ways to get into this comp. You just use AD item holders. It's going to be Ashe, Draven mainly, and then sometimes you could use Camille or Jax, but I think Ashe and Draven are my favorite personally because they use Jhin items so well. And then for AP items, it could really be anyone because Viego kind of holds like tankish items. So any tank could do, like you could put it on Renekton, Titans, Ionic Spark on a Renekton does just fine. And then once you pivot into this comp, you just switch the items onto whoever you want. We do have a full list of items for both Jhin and Viego down here if you want to check that out. And then for augments, really what you like is the healing augments. That way you don't have to build so much healing on your comp because Viego makes very, very good use of healing. I'd say that would be like the most important thing to get when you go for augments. You don't need like too much healing, but just like 1 or 2 sources of healing, such as like 1 item, 1 augment, or just like 1 augment is good enough. Onto Infiniteam. This build is really good if you get the emblems, as you guys can see here in the augments already, like Infiniteam Soul, Infiniteam Crest, Infiniteam Heart, like all those are just gonna be the best for this build. And the reason why is because you could unlock the 7 Infiniteam Power Spike. Remember how last set Lasercorps was really good at like 9 Lasercorps? It's kind of the same, but for Infiniteam. And the reason why is because if you ever get a back row Infiniteam, getting double Ezreal with 7 Infiniteam is almost like an auto win. The comp is A tier regularly, but if you do get one of these crests, it turns into like S, maybe even S+. Moving down into how to play the comp, you generally run Infiniteam with Pantheon Lucian early game, plus 1 other Infiniteam. It could be like Sivir, it could be like an early Shen, things of that nature. And then you slowly go into 5 or 7 Infiniteam later on. In the mid game, and this is where the +1 Infiniteam really plays a big role, you can get up to 5 Infiniteam really easily without needing Twisted Fate, which is really hard to get, and that really unlocks the comp's power in the mid game and saves you a ton of HP. So again, A tier when you don't have the augments, and S+, maybe S if you do. One thing you could do is build the emblem yourself, even if you don't get the augment, by getting a spatula on a carousel, because spatula plus sword builds the Infiniteam emblem. So you could just put that on some tank unit that you want to clone in the front, like sometimes you could put it on your Garen, or just like some damage unit in the back if you have like multiple backline ones. I haven't really seen that yet. It's normally like 1 front line, 1 backline that I've seen most of the time, but I'm not sure if it's like kind of random placements or whatnot. Pretty much the comp revolves around Ezreal though. Ezreal is really hard to get. Obviously, you want 2-star Ezreal, but like if you get 2-star legendaries, like you might as well just buy a lottery ticket. So most games you have to settle for 1-star Ezreal, and that's good enough for like a top 4 most of the time. However, if you do win the game, it generally will be on the back of an Ezreal 2-star, which does happen still, but it's going to be hard to do. So obviously you need it to win. You don't always have to win every game, so don't think that the comp is like super reliant on like all the legendaries. It's just something that kind of really helps. So you also can't like pick and choose your items for Ezreal because you don't really build items thinking you're going to get the legendary. So build around Twisted Fate items and then have the random leftovers for Ezreal later on. It's kind of like playing around Aphelios when you played Oxforce last set. I'm going to make this the last reference to the last set if I can. But like you built around Viego, you didn't really build around Aphelios. But if you did get Aphelios, it was like great, you know? But on to the next build, we have Vex Reroll. Vex Reroll is still pretty solid. If you just get a good start for it, you just go for it. And there are a couple of different versions. We have the mascot version. We have the supers version over here. You don't have to go supers. You could go for the full 6 mascot version, or you could do like the Riftwalker version. Those are both pretty solid. It just depends on what type of game you're getting. But if you can get the supers, it's pretty nice because you do get a lot of 3-stars. And obviously if you have a lot of 3-star supers is really good. But yeah, different ways to play the build, even if it's a reroll comp. A lot of people think reroll comps are not that flexible, but they actually kind of are, especially this one, because there are like 3 different versions that I mentioned already, not including funky stuff you could do if you get different augments. But First Aid Kit, really, really good on this because you just have so much healing with the mascots, and then obviously any mascot or like reroll augment such as Golden Ticket or Think Fast is really, really good just because you really need as many 3-stars as you can get. Obviously, if you play the other versions where it's not as 3-star reliant on the supers, you still need the 3-star Vex, but you don't need the econ augments as much as this version. But pretty simple to do. You just want to reroll at level 6 or 7. So we go over that here. If you have a mascot, emblem, or heart, you should opt to reroll at level 7 for 5 mascot and 3 Riftwalkers so that you could get to 6 mascot due to Riftwalker's +1 trait ability. If you get something like Rock Solid, which is Malphite's augment, which is a 2 cost, rolling at 6 is really good to get the other supers to 3-star as well. And then after you do that, you roll at 7 so that you could get Vex 3. But again, we talk about the different builds in the how to play section, so do feel free to check that out in your free time. Next build up we have is Duelist. So Duelist is just the same old Locket Duelist build from before. Pretty solid for top 4s, nothing like too crazy about it. It's really easy to play as well. If you ever get a bunch of Duelists in the early game, if you could play like 4 Duelists on 2-1 with a Locket Slam, like that's just like the best start ever for this type of build. But even if you don't get that, let's say you only meet one of those conditions, you still kind of could go for it as long as no one else is playing it. Or maybe you get a really good augment for it. So one augment that's not listed here that I really like is Phony Frontline, because Phony Frontline really unlocks the power of Lockets like super hard. So that's personally my favorite augment, even though it's not listed here. Obviously, Duelists, Emblems, and Crests are really good to get to 8 Duelists. It's a really big power spike during stage 4 and 5. Knife's Edge, really good for the early game. And then stuff like Combat Training, you could use that if you get an early Vayne drop. You know how sometimes in stage 1, you sometimes get a random 3-cost unit? If you get that plus Combat Training, your Vayne's going to be hitting super hard in the late game if you get like a lot of stacks on her. But yeah, this comp is more of a top 4 comp. It can't really win out a lot of games unless you get really lucky. I managed to do it once this set already, but it's not something you aim for. I was very surprised that I won. So to play this build, you just want to try to spike early and then slowly bleed out. So to do that, you want to get to 6 Duelists as fast as possible. And you could do that by rolling at level 6 on stage 3-2 for 6 Duelists, and then maybe a couple of 2-star units if you have a bunch of pairs. Or you could wait until stage 4-1 and get Vayne 2-star, Nyla 2-star, and like hopefully 1 Twisted Fate. One good item holder you could use is Kayle, because Kayle is also a Duelist, but you end up dropping her later if you don't get one of the augments, so that's something to keep in mind whenever you're like trying to shift items over or pivot into this comp a little slower. So if you have attack damage items, Vayne's going to be your main carry. If you have more AP items like Static Shiv or something like that, Twisted Fate's going to be pretty good with it, but you don't really care about that. You just want 2 Lockets, because Locket is really just the best item in this build. I've even seen people do 3 Lockets. That might be a bit overkill, but I think 2 Lockets is kind of the sweet spot, but you need at least one of them. Onto the next build, we have Jinx Reroll. Good old Jinx Reroll. It's really good with scope weapons. That's like S++ tier augment for this comp, but you could still kind of play it with an RFC. It's just like a lot weaker, because it's kind of hard to just play around 1 gold augment as like your game plan for a comp, you know? But other than that, like Battle Mage, super good for this build, because like AP plus armor, that's like exactly the stats that Jax needs, and he's in the second row anyways. But you just play vertical brawlers. Vertical just means going deep into a trade, such as like 6 or 8 brawlers, whereas a horizontal comp would be something like 2 brawlers splashing into like 5 or 10 different trades, something like that. But you really just care about brawlers in this build, so you just do a vertical brawler, get as many brawlers as possible. For your admins, you really want something that gives like team attack speed, team AP, or something like that. Anything that gives Jax more damage will do pretty nicely. One other thing to keep in mind is do not play Jax without RFC or scope weapons, because you really just need the extra range on him, because that's the most important thing he can ever have. None of the other items or nothing else really matters apart from that, because it probably turns into like a B tier comp without extra range. If you played last set, this comp pretty much plays the same. You just swap out Soraka for Warwick, and you just get your admin that way. Another good thing is that since Warwick kind of is a brawler himself, you could play a random extra unit such as like Aurelion Soul to just give like anti-heal to your team, or just like run random legendaries or a random secondary carry. Like I've seen some people even use like Misfortune randomly because they just happen to have good items for her. But you really want to play around like your Jax and Warwick, because Aesol's good because he doesn't require any items to really like shine. He can still put his healing debuff, and that's really all you need from him. So really just focus on tank items, Jax items, then Warwick items, because Warwick can still kind of carry in this build. Onto the next build we have is Lasercorps. Lasercorps, really good with 5 Lasercorps. However, Lasercorps Heart and Crown were removed temporarily. They're going to add it back in next patch, I'm pretty sure, but it definitely weakened the comp a ton. You could still play for Lasercorps if you get like Toma traits or something like that, but it's a little less reliable than before. Luckily, if you play like every Lasercorps unit, you could still get to 5 Lasercorps. I believe that's Ashe, Yasuo, Warwick, Mordekaiser, and Renekton, but it's hard to get Mordekaiser, so you really have to wait for that power spike later on. But yeah, there's not really too much else to say about this comp. The only thing that does damage is like the Lasercorps thing. That's why you just mainly focus on like survivability and tankiness in this build. Next build up we have is Threats. So Threats is just generic like Bel'Veth or Aesol carry comp, and then you just run other threat units just because they're pretty solid. Also with Aatrox, he works in a lot of builds nowadays. Like you could play Aatrox as your main tank by removing like the primary tank of other builds, pretty seamlessly in most cases, as long as they weren't like super critical to the comp, just because Aatrox is pretty solid. So always flex around Aatrox if you can, because I think he's like a pretty solid unit and maybe a bit underplayed right now. Don't be afraid to flex in some threat units, because they all are like splashable as like item holders temporarily or like permanently. And they always provide some utility that you could be lacking in your team. For example, some builds, they really revolve around having a Last Whisper or a Static Shiv to reduce resistances, and you could just play a Morgana if you don't get that item. So it's not like the end of the world if you don't have a Last Whisper. Obviously, you still are going for the Last Whisper, but you could kind of play the Morgana temporarily until then. Not much else to say about this build though. It's just like another option that you kind of have in the game. Onto the B tier, we have some janky reroll comps such as like Jinx. Jinx is just like... Obviously, you need the carry augment for Jinx before you do this, and then you just play her plus a bunch of Anima squad and pretty much just hope for the best. It's pretty much the same build as the MF build, except you run both Jinx and MF carry, and then it really just plays the same after that. Next build up we have is Draven Reroll. Draven Reroll I thought was really good. It's still pretty popular, and I feel like people might be overplaying it a little bit, because you should only go for it in specific situations, and some people like hackering their Draven. It's all like pretty good options there. They nerfed Hacker, so that's why he got a little weaker. But you pretty much have to decide on stage like 2-1 whether you go for Draven Reroll or not, because you need a good augment for him, you need a lot of copies for him, and you need good items for him. So like all the sword items are going to work well on Draven, like Last Whisper, Infinity Edge, +1 healing item, pretty much perfect build for him. If you do get a mech spatula, that's also pretty nice, because you get to hit 5 mech pretty easily. So you just need Wukong, Jax, Draven, plus Garen, plus a spatula, and that way you don't need to wait to hit your Leona in order to get 5 Mecha Prime. It's pretty hard to play around hitting Leona, especially since the power spike between 3 and 5 Mecha Prime is so big. So if you do get the spatula, definitely like take advantage of that. Pretty much all you just need though is Draven 3-star, Last Whisper, plus some form of healing, either from augments or from Infinity Edge, and that's pretty much it. Onto the next build, we have Hearts Reroll. This is going to be with like Lee Sin, Sona, things like that. You pretty much just slow roll for both of them at level 6 or 7, depending on what you need. Generally, I think I like doing it at level 7 more, because Lee Sin isn't as important as Sona or LeBlanc 3, because Lee Sin's the only 2-cost unit in the comp, so it doesn't make that much sense to reroll at level 6. But if you reroll at level 7, you could hit Sona 3, LeBlanc 3. You could still hit Lee Sin 3-star, it just takes a little longer. And you could also get like 1 or 2-star Echo, 1 or 2-star Viego. Next and final build we have is the Sureshots. So Sureshots, they have a couple of different versions available. This one is going to be the Defender plus Mecha Prime one, where you Mecha Prime your Garen. It plays very similarly to the old Mecha Prime Samira, but it definitely is much weaker compared to other comps right now. I'm not saying you can't play it ever. All I'm saying is that it's just not as good as like some people say. And it's not a comp that I would enter the game in thinking that I'm going to go for it from the very start. So I might start with a bow, and we'll go into starting items right after this. And when I get that, I'm not thinking like, hey, I'm going to get the bow and play Samira. I'm thinking, hey, I'm going to get the bow and play Twisted Fate. So if you're going for Twisted Fate and then you just happen to get perfect Samira items plus like maybe an early Samira, then yeah, go for Samira. If not, just keep trying to go for your Twisted Fate. Fast 8 for this build is going to be what you want to do. Just because Garen and Samira are pretty much the 2 units you play around. That's going to be it for the comps. Let's move on into items. Tier, bow, those are the 2 best starting items of this patch right now. Tier's very good because of Spellslingers and Anima squad. You make the Spear of Shojin that we talked about earlier. And then you could also build Static Shiv, which is nice. Chalice of Power is pretty usable. Archangel Staff decent, and even a blue buff can be replaceable with the Spear of Shojin. Bow is really good for making Static Shiv. And you also have other options such as like playing AD, which is a bit worse, but it still is an option. It's like the whole Samira situation we were talking about before. And then Twisted Fate, if you're going for him, you could use like infinite bows. You could build Static Shiv, you could build Rage Blade, you could build Giant Slayer. I guess you could even build like double Static Shiv too. I've seen that build do really well on like data-wise, though I've never tried it. But pretty much you'll never run out of uses of bows in this meta right now. But yeah. We have some other like start recommendations down here if you happen to get some of the other items. So definitely check that out when you have free time. Again, it's all on the website, bunnymuffins.lol/meta. We update this every single Friday. So hopefully this helps you in your climb. We will be adding more comps as the set moves on. But right now, in the beginning of the set, there's always like a really polarizing meta. And because of that, like not many comps are like that viable. But as the meta matures, as like the balanced team balances the game a little bit more and more comps will be added to the list. I think like last set we had like 6 or 7 S tier comps, but right now we just have 2, and we had like a lot of A tier comps, so probably like 10 plus A tier comps. But right now the list is a lot smaller because there just isn't that many things you want to go for right now, at least in my opinion. But that's going to be it from me today. I will be streaming hopefully pretty often in this next week. So definitely check that out, twitch.tv/BunnyMuffinsLOL. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe. And of course, smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.